grain, right? Because they were hungry.
I'm going to make you so happy in a second.
Oh, good. Sorry.
No, you're fine, because we're going to go there. I mean, that's what we should be doing, right? Anytime we're talking about these things, we should be trying to connect these parts.
Welcome to TBC Extra, a weekly podcast of our Sunday sermon and a little extra. I am Teresa Jenkins, the communications director here at Topeka Bible Church.
And I'm Jason Brent, the children's pastor at Topeka Bible Church, and we're glad you're here. And now for a little extra.
Hey, look, it's you.
Hey, it's me.
It's me. We're here.
We're here.
No substitutes needed.
That's true.
Sorry
yeah.
for those of you who were hoping we'd be gone again. Well, we're back. You had a very exciting, this happens every summer.
Yes.
In fact, we talked about it last time I was on. I think we talked about how you go from Camp Catapult to Camp Catapult in the Wild to tennis clinic to family camp. But now this year you built in a little period of rest.
An extra thing right in a row. Else. Yeah. We had a great family camp. It was great, and I think everything went really well. And then every 2 years, we've been doing this, we think for 8 to 10 vacations. We were trying to figure out, but about 20, I guess for the last 20 years almost, every other year my family takes a family vacation. This year was 19 of us going to there.
That's big.
And so we came back from Oklahoma on Sunday afternoon from family camp.
That was family camp.
And then I came into the office to get ready for the next Sunday on Monday morning, and then we left about 1 o'clock to go to Branson with our family. And so, but yeah, it was really a fun time. When people say, "Oh, Branson, did you see this or this or that?" The answer is probably not.
You just do your family thing.
We swim and play pool and play cards and do that kind of thing, and it's just fun to catch up with the family.
Sounds fun, and it sounds like it's kind of low key and not like overscheduled.
It certainly is more low key than other vacations could be.
And you're not working.
Yeah,
like you
not
were
working.
At family camp.
Yeah, sure. And we went to the only Branson-y thing we did was we went to Silver Dollar City, and it was a beautiful day for it. I think the high was mid-70s that day. So it was 2 years before we went to Silver Dollar City, it was like 100 degrees and it was so hot, but it was really great. So
yeah, I'm glad you got to go last week while the weather kind of
we're having a little reprieve here from the hot weather.
Yeah, it's like, would you rather have 80s for tennis camp week, family camp week, or your vacation week? And it's okay to be selfish.
Okay.
And Camp Catapult in the Wild. We'll throw that in there too.
If you're going to fill that one. So before you put Camp Catapult in the Wild there, I would have been totally fine just saying if I could pick 80s, I would do it for tennis camp weekday, because it was super hot this year, and it's just so hot when it's 100 degrees on the court.
Out there on that tennis court, and we've got like 100 some kids all told, right? Like between both of them together, I can't remember, but it impacts a lot of kids.
It was warm this year for Camp Catapult in the Wild, but 2 years ago, there was a couple days that was high 90s, maybe triple digits, and one of the activities they do is called Nature Hike.
Oh, no.
Which is about 1.5 miles to 2 miles hike through the nature. And one of our volunteers, Karina Soto, oh man, it was her afternoon for... Because they break up, it's kind of just random. So like one group goes in the morning, one group goes in the afternoon, Monday through Thursday.
Was their turn.
You just rotate around. And she got actually maybe it's the morning, but it was super hot. And she came back up out from the hill, and she was just profusely sweating. And I was like, oh goodness, we probably lost a volunteer
Bless
here.
Her heart,
but
because
she came back this year. So yeah.
If you didn't see our Thanksgiving story with the Sotos, Karina had just started attending a few months before.
Yeah.
And she signed up for Camp Catapult volunteering, and she said, use me where you need me as far as which camp.
Yeah.
Well, we needed her for both camps.
We needed her for both,
so
of course.
Her first time volunteering, she did both. God bless the Sotos.
Yes,
especially
very much.
Karina.
And they were at the family camp too, and actually brought a couple extra people, their cousins and nephews. So that was super fun.
That's exciting. Good.
Yeah. How about you? How about your vacation plannings?
In October, we're planning to go to. It's so nice when you don't have young children in the home, so you don't have to plan around school year.
Yes,
we're going in
that's true.
October to Colorado. We've been to southern Colorado in October, and we loved it. It was so beautiful. Now we're going to be up with some friends up north by the Denver area. And right now we don't have an itinerary. Just whatever we decide.
Knowing your friends, you'll probably get an itinerary.
I'm sure we will. and we'll be just fine with it. Well, thanks for sharing about your downtime. Do you feel fully rested and restored, ready to get back to work?
Well, so I mean, kinda. Yeah, definitely, it was interesting being on, because family camp is in Oklahoma too. So it was kind of like 2 trips back to back. It was like a camp that you come home at night, and so it was quite tiring. It took me a little bit to get into vacation mode. I was tired enough, I guess I should have. And then coming back, we got back at 2:00 last night. And I hit the ground running. I do feel pretty good today.
Yesterday afternoon or this morning?
Oh, I say, yesterday afternoon, Monday afternoon.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So
good.
no, we didn't get, we don't travel at 2 a.m. There might be other staff meetings with the initials J and last name D that may travel at 2 a.m, but we don't know. We do not do that. All sensible times most of the time for our family.
Yes.
So.
Yes. Well, we hope you will enjoy a little rest listening to this sermon about work. Our Guardrails series continues with Connor Krause.
Good morning, everybody. So last week we began a new series called Guardrails, and Guardrails is looking at this idea that there are certain things in the Bible which are black and white, do this, don't do this, and there are certain things in our lives that God presents to us as sort of guardrails, where he says, don't go too far this way and don't go too far this way. And last week we looked at time, for instance, and said that time was something that we need to look at from both an eternal perspective, right? Appreciating God's plan for humanity and sort of trusting that it began before us and will continue after us. And then also going up against the other guardrail that our life is finite and we don't have unlimited amounts of time to carry out his will in our lifespan, because we are, as we looked at, smoke, mist, dew, all the things that end very quickly, right? So this morning, we're going to be looking at a different topic, and it kind of relates to time. Because outside of sleeping, the thing that the majority of us are spending our time on is work. And when I talk about work, I don't mean clock in, clock out kind of work, because there are a number of us who are working who don't get a paycheck for that work. As we're going to be talking about work this morning and the guardrails that God has presented for this consistent and necessary activity in our life, we're establishing it really from the perspective of how God defines work, which is, are we doing something that is productive? Are we doing something that is providing? And is it carrying out God's will for us? And that can be everything from taking care of kids to working at the bank to stocking shelves and everything in between. But there are guardrails that God has presented for us when it comes to work. And so as we look at that this morning, the first text that we're going to go to is all the way at the beginning in Genesis 2. So if you'd like to turn to Genesis 2 with me, we're going to see that work is something that God sets the example for us in his creative work of the world. In Genesis chapter 2, it says, "So the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. On the seventh day, God had completed his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done." And then in verse 15, it says, "The Lord God took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to work it and watch over it." And so from the very, very beginning, God's creative work right, of bringing this world into existence is something that is defined as work, right? And there's no like 401k plan here when we're talking about the work of creation, right? And so this is why we can say that our definition of work is expanded beyond the things that we receive a paycheck for in our daily lives, though that's obviously included. God is producing, He is providing, He is bringing forth good things and it's a little tricky when we talk about the effort of God, because when we talk about Him and His creative work, the reason that God rests isn't because He's tired, but the reason that God rests after 6 days is to look back upon the work of His creation, to appreciate it, and to state that it is a good thing. The act of rest, which we'll get to later on, the act of rest, though, is something that comes in after the work has been done, after the creative effort, after the production, after the provision, after all of these things, and it is a special time that is designated and looking back upon what was done so heartily, right? So God sets the example for us, first of all, when it comes to work, that He worked for 6 days and then He rested for 1, and that what God was doing was good. But let's talk about Adam, because when verse 15 is introduced here, Eve isn't around just yet, all right? Adam is placed into the Garden of Eden, and he is given 2 jobs. He is to work it, and he is to watch over it. And what's significant about this section of Scripture is that sin has not entered into the world yet. And so in the Garden of Eden, in the beauty of God's creation, in full fellowship with God, everything as it should be, Adam's working. Adam has a job within the garden. And this job, the very first job that Adam is given, is he's supposed to name all of the animals. He's supposed to name all the animals that God brings before him. And as he does that, and they get through all the animals, right, it is shown that there is not a suitable companion and helper to Adam present in the things that God has created, and thus Eve comes about to form this dynamic pairing that is then given a new task. As a couple, Adam and Eve are then given the work sort of requirement that is presented for the rest of creation, the same thing actually that flows on through the nation of Israel, which is that they are to be fruitful and multiply, and then that they are also to subdue creation. They are to multiply and be masters over creation. Again, both of those things are presented before sin has entered into the world. And so you can imagine what's going on as Adam and Eve are eating and working with animals and things like this. The idea present before sin taints anything is that they would multiply, and their descendants, bearing the image of God, would continue this work into the rest of creation, bringing it into the vision that God had for His people, those made in His image, to work and rule over His creation, the animals and plants and things of that sort. But Genesis 3 comes along, right? Sin enters into the world. Adam is guilty for not protecting Eve from bringing these things in. That's why Adam is later blamed, though Eve is the one who actually eats of the fruit. And Satan, his temptation in Genesis 3 is presented there as well as an instigator of this whole thing. And after Genesis 3 and sin enters into the world, and Adam and Eve recognize that a significant and impassable rift has been created between them and God because they've rebelled in His kingdom, in His perfect creation, God then brings a curse upon the world because of their sin. And this curse is very unique in the way that it affects the 2 jobs that they were given to do in God's creation. Remember, to multiply and to be masters over the earth. This is what it says in Genesis 3, verses 16 through 19. God says, "I will intensify your labor pains. You will bear children with painful effort. Your desire will be for your husband, yet he will rule over you." That was for Eve. And then for Adam, it says, "The ground is cursed because of you. You will eat from it by means of painful labor all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. You will eat bread by the sweat of your brow until you return to the ground, since you were taken from it. For you are dust, and you will return to dust." That last sentence there kind of reminds us last week of the measurement of time. And so how God has sort of framed this is that within your lifetime now, this dust to dust language, your experience of work is going to be signified by this unique word in Hebrew where he says pains, and then he says you will eat from it by means of painful labor. So both Adam and Eve are their work that they are primarily responsible for, Eve for producing and bringing forth children, and Adam for working the ground, right? What is happening here is that both of their jobs now, both of their work is going to be defined by this special word in Hebrew that's pronounced like itzabon. Itzabon is this special word for pain, and it's only used one other time than these two sections right here, and it's later on in Genesis 5 when Noah is said to be the one that will rescue the world from what is often translated as agonizing labor. And so what is itzabon is the question. What is this new context that work has been shaped in where it is alternatively described as sorrow and as pain and as difficulty? See, last week we talked about with time, we said time, listen, it's a neutral thing. And when it's in the context of being in God with eternity, it's good. You want a lot of time with God and to be in his presence. It's sin that has tainted the way that we experience time, how now it brings death to us, and it's sort of more of a ticking clock than it is an expansive experience with Jesus. Well, work in the same way has been changed and shifted because of sin as well. Work is supposed to be something that is joyful and fulfilling, and based upon what we see here and how the curse changes it, work is supposed to be easy. When God is telling Adam that not only will the earth now be difficult and cursed, but you'll eat bread by the sweat of your brow until you return to the ground, right? It gives this image that wasn't the way that things were going to work beforehand. Certainly death was not a part of the arrangement before sin. And so this pain is present in work, and this pain is now the context, this itzabon, is now the context that we work under. You fast forward now from Genesis to our context, right? Our lives, our work. And like I said, work, being productive and providing. So you're taking care of kids in the home, you're working and you're getting a paycheck, you're taking care of your house, your family, you're doing all the things that are necessary for life, where you're producing, you're providing, you're carrying out God's will, and you're giving hard effort towards these things. Right? They are now spoken of in a way that is not reminiscent of the garden, but is now signified by difficulty. So this brings us actually to our first guardrail this morning, which is that work in its original space is something that is good, it is supposed to bring joy, and it is fulfilling because it is not marked by sin. Work as it was originally intended is something that we should rejoice in and have the privilege of participating in. The fact that Adam and Eve get to multiply in God's creation, the fact that they get to be masters and subdue God's creation and work within it in a space that was easy and life-giving, that's a privilege. It's a beautiful thing. And that's part of sort of the memory we need to have of work as now we have to wrestle with the pain. But there are two responses that we have to our work now being difficult and our work now having this pain, sorrow, agony associated with it, right? There are two responses that we normally have to that. One of them is we slack off, right? Pain, we sort of feel like it's tough sledding, right? And we're having difficulty in our work. We don't like how hard it is. And so we slack off. And frankly, that one, if you're looking at a flow chart, that one loops back around to the first guardrail. And we say, well, slacking off is not the response that we are to have to the work that God has given to us, because even though it is signified by pain, it is still a command that we have been given that everybody is supposed to be working. This is why in 2 weeks when we talk about finances, Proverbs says that a slack hand brings poverty. This is also why Paul says in 2 Thessalonians that anyone who was not working and was able to work in Thessalonica was not deserving of the bread that the fellowship was handing out. Work is a good thing. It's a necessary thing. It is part of who we are as image bearers, right? God worked, still works. And as those created in his image, we are supposed to do the same. But the other way that we respond to this pain, instead of slacking off, is by pushing so hard into work that it becomes this exhausting, tiring affair that brings burnout, right? That we somehow along the way have become so attached to the idea of work and overcoming the toil and the pain that it brings, that now it begins to look a lot more like our identity, the work that we're doing. Right? Just think for a second how many times, whether you do this or people you know, when somebody says, "How are you doing?" one of the first two responses, "We're so busy right now." Right? Everybody says that. Like there's a presence that we have where we like to be seen as those who are busy, right? That we have lots of things going on, that we are working very, very hard. And there's an element of pride that can creep in here when we aren't able to adequately balance the way that God has for us to work. We push into these things and they create exhaustion. And the problem is not necessarily like too much hard work, right? I know some of you farmers, you just finished hay season, right? And when you cut the hay and it's on the ground, and because of weather and moisture and all these different things, like some days you just work from sun up till sundown. I'm not saying that hard work or that seasons of difficult, strenuous effort is something that is bad. In fact, I think that is good. But what I am saying is that when this identity that we have around work has prolonged periods of excessive work as a source of pride, that we treat ourselves like machines, right? That we are almost inhuman, and that we need people to see us as those who just are working our fingers to the bone so that we might get, it could be various reasons, credibility, attention, just being seen as successful, right? Don't want to be seen as lazy. Whatever it is, we have a problem here. Because work, even in its original place, back in the garden, still involved rest. Work is always supposed to be balanced by rest. And in fact, God himself rested. In the book of Mark, there's a situation where Jesus is on the Sea of Galilee. See, at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, this is where he started out, and he would often give messages near the water's edge or even standing in a boat, because the natural acoustics of the topography meant that his voice was amplified as it went up the hill, right? And so he could speak to thousands of people who were gathered there to see him without any natural or artificial amplification to his voice. And so anyhow, Jesus is often teaching by the water's edge. And as thousands of people are streaming in to see Jesus, not necessarily because they want to call him Messiah, but because they want to see the miracles, they want to be healed, they want to, understand what the ruckus is all about. Thousands of people are pressing into them, to Jesus and the disciples as they are teaching. And this is what he says after one particularly long day of ministering to the crowds. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. Jesus said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a remote place and rest for a while." For many people were coming and going, and they did not have time to eat. So the disciples are working so hard, and Jesus is working so hard, that ministering to the crowds meant that they had to skip lunch, right? They were working diligently. People are pressing in. And like I said, this is the context of these relationships. Jesus has not yet pared down his ministry. And in a few chapters, he's going to give them some very hard challenges that is going to make many people walk away. But coming on the heels of this passage right here is the feeding of the 5,000 miracle. Right? And so thousands of people are pressing in. And at the end of the day, the disciples come to Jesus and he says, "You know what? We're going to get in a boat and we're going to go to the other side of the lake here, because this is too much and you need to rest." And right at that moment is when the questions begin, right? What about the people they didn't get to talk to? Well, weren't there more people that needed to be healed? Couldn't they have relied on the power of the Spirit to just keep going endlessly? Well, there's only a small amount of time that they could hear this message. Shouldn't they have just sort of like sucked it up and kept going, right? That's the part of us that often rails against rest, that says, you know what, the fact that Jesus rested was a problem. You know, if you're in the camp of overworking, exhaustion, and burnout, let me say something that you both know and probably need to hear again. You're not stronger than Jesus. You're not. I'm not stronger than Jesus. You're not stronger than Jesus. None of us are. And the image that is presented to us of the second person of the Trinity, fully God and fully man, is that he needs to rest. You might be familiar with the story of Jesus with the woman at the well. That's in John chapter 4. Jesus is walking from Galilee. He's going back to Galilee from Judea, and he's in Samaria. And it's in the heat of the day. It's hot. He's tired from walking miles and miles and miles, even though he's taken the shortcut through Samaria. And it said, the beginning of the account of him with the woman at the well is that he was tired and he sat down. There's an element here that we have to understand, right? Which is that humanity, the part that makes us weak and frail and needing a Savior, is also the part of us that demands that we rest. There is a physical need for it, and an emotional need for it, and a spiritual need for it, because if we don't rest and we continue to push into for whatever your motivation is, there are a lot of different reasons why you might be somebody who struggles with rest, right? Maybe it's a season of your life right now, right, where you don't have the ability to clock out of the thing that you're doing. Teresa, whoever was giving announcements in the cab was speaking about the support groups that we have that are going to be starting up here in the fall. Maybe you're in the caregiver support group, right? And you don't have the ability to take a step back and just breathe right now. There are always reasons for why rest might be eluding you in a season. But oftentimes, the thing that rails against this the most is not the season of life that brings a lack of rest, but the excessive pursuit of finding our identity in work that is toilsome and difficult, and having people recognize us for those 70-hour work weeks, for the hashtag hustle culture, right? For the fact that we want to be known as people who are working, and that there's a little bit of us, or at least in a lot of us, that if we say that we just spent the day at home resting, that we feel like we still have to come up with another project that we did while we were at home, because it's not sufficient to just say, I took it easy. Even Jesus needed to rest. God himself didn't. And remember, this rest is something that is supposed to be balanced with work, right? But if, for those of you who are more familiar with the Bible, you've wondered why I haven't brought up the topic of the Sabbath yet, I'm actually going to discuss that more in the podcast. It's kind of a big topic, and what I wanted to focus on this morning is simply the relationship between work and rest in general terms. Both are necessary, both are needed. Working too much or resting too little becomes problematic. And so, like last week, what does it look like for us to do this well? What does it look like for us to live with balance in these things? We're actually going to go back to the book of Ecclesiastes to finish out like we did last week, to see what the King Solomon, having experienced all the wonder and splendor of the world, right, what he says life is truly about. So if you want to turn to Ecclesiastes with me, chapter 5, this is what Solomon says. Here is what I've seen to be good. It is appropriate to eat, drink, and experience good in all the labor one does under the sun during the few days of his life God has given him, because that is his reward. Furthermore, everyone to whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also allowed him to enjoy them, take his reward, and rejoice in his labor. This is a gift of God, for he does not often consider the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with the joy of his heart. Now, a lot of commands in the book of Ecclesiastes are kind of grim, you could say. Some of them don't always paint this for being, sort of the answer to life. Sometimes they paint this bleak picture in some of the words he uses. He's right, toiling under the sun and things like that. But look at let's start at the last sentence. This is a gift of God, what you're able to do. For he does not, the individual who's working does not often consider the days of their life because God keeps them occupied with the joy of their heart. The conclusion to what he's saying here is that we might live and walk and be with God in a way that is fulfilling, even though our work is distinguished by itzabon. Our work is distinguished by sorrow and difficulty and pain and hardship, that not all jobs are easy. Not all jobs feel rewarding in and of themselves. Not all jobs we wake up Monday morning and we're like, can't wait to head in, right? Not all jobs are like that. In fact, a lot of them aren't. And that should be our expectation, right? Not the exception. See, what he means here when Solomon is talking is he is balancing these two things. It is appropriate to eat and drink and experience good and all the labor one does under the sun during the few days of their life. What he's going to balance is the fact that the work that they're doing, as he says, under the sun that's difficult, what it also brings about is a very rewarding rest. That the further somebody is pushing into this element of hard work, the more their rest becomes something that is satisfying and joyful. And especially as we're looking at the relationship between what work provides and how we're able to enjoy it thereafter. He does have the little sentence there in the middle where he says that, for some people, hard work brings riches and wealth, but the blessing of riches and wealth is something that is over and above the normative experience that everybody is working and everybody is resting. Again, when Solomon is speaking here, there are no retirement plans or 40-hour work weeks, right? He's speaking about a nation of Israel that is primarily, the vast majority of them are working out in the sun, in the fields, either with crops or with livestock, right? And then you have some tradespeople, but there aren't, those who are putting tires on cars, and there aren't those who are doing day trading in the office, and there aren't people who are, at C-suite level jobs. What is happening here is the vast majority of those that Solomon is speaking to live hard lives of subsistence. And it's actually a relatively modern thing in our world that we even have the privilege of being able to decide between a couple different jobs that we might want to pursue, or even have the consideration about which jobs might be more fulfilling to us. You look back in these biblical times, whatever your dad did is what you're doing. That's your job, and that's going to be your job. And then when you have kids, they're going to pick up the family business, right? This is the way that things worked. So if you have a job right now, and again, right, I'm using that kind of as in an expressive term, that I very much believe in the work that people are doing to take care of the home, and the work that people are doing where they don't get paid, and to care for others, and many other things. Production, provision, right? But if you have that job and you enjoy it, recognize that that is a blessing from the Lord, because that is not supposed to be the expectation. The expectation is that the work that we are doing reminds us of the sin that is in this world. And so when you have a boss that is breathing down your back, when things aren't going right, when you're frustrated by your assignment or the people that you're doing, or you have one of these jobs that is much more reminiscent of the work in ancient Israel. You're working out in the fields. You're working in the warehouse that doesn't have air conditioning, right? You're digging ditches so that we can have sewer lines. You're all of these things that are happening, The expectation is that we would be reminded of toil and the sin that has been brought into this world, and it would stand in contrast to the kind of job that God has prepared for us, or prepared for Adam and Eve, and the kind of work that we have waiting for us in heaven. See, this is the other side of the coin here, is that just as it was in the Garden of Eden, so it will be in the future. I don't know how you're going to take this. There will be work in heaven. You're going to have a job, right? But that job, just like Adam and Eve in the garden, is not going to be marked by toil and difficulty and frustration. It is going to be as joyful as it would have been when God comes to Adam, he says, hey, do you want to just like name this animal? It's green and it has a hard shell on its back and it looks cute when it waddles around. And he's like, I think turtle works, right? You know, like the joy that comes from being a part of God's creation and the joy that comes from working in lockstep with him the way that it was always supposed to be. And the thing that is most fulfilling to you, like, don't lose that. It's not like people are working on an assembly line in heaven. We have jobs that are fulfilling to us and work that is fulfilling to us as a community in Christ for eternity. But work is no longer marked by the sin that eats a bone, the pain that it is marked by now. And this is a mindset shift, right? Because the joy that is supposed to come from the work in this life, from dust to dust. See, Solomon is saying God keeps them occupied with the joy of their heart. Joy in your circumstances now is possible. But the joy isn't necessarily supposed to come from the kind of work that you're doing, the specific job that you have, right? If that was the case, then exactly how much money we're making or how much prestige or how much success or attention or all of those things, being able to work up the ladder, all of those things would be ultimately important if the job itself is what was supposed to bring joy. But what is bringing joy is the fact that we are working hard, the fact that we are working at all, the fact that we are living and breathing as image bearers of God and carrying out his mission in this world to the best of our abilities. The fact that we work at all diligently is the thing that we are supposed to take pride in, not an unhealthy sense because we never stop, but the fact that we are doing the thing that God has called us to do. That's what brings us joy. And it might be a little simplistic, and you can build upon this, but the image that's presented here is then one of going home after the hard day's work, cutting the fields of wheat by hand with a scythe and putting them into bushels or whatever it was, and going home and knowing that your work was providing. Or knowing that the work, Proverbs 31, the work that you were doing in caring for the home or for other people, or you were industrious, and all of these things, starting your own business, that those were providing for other people. It's a balance. It's a balance. So what are we supposed to do? Well, we work within the guardrails, right? No pun intended. So on one set, you have the fact that work is part of being made in God's image. It is critical to our fulfillment and sense of joy and purpose in this life, even if you don't get $1 for it. That having a job or having something that you are working at that is producing and providing, as long as you are physically capable of doing it. And even then, I would say that there are things that we can do with our other faculties, even if we're not physically capable, that are still pursuing this element of work, that's necessary for you to be fully fulfilled in your job or in your existence here from dust to dust. And so there are some of us, right, who are watching a little too much Gunsmoke, okay? Turner Classic Movies is on a little too much. There's some of us who enjoy the beauty of rest and lean into it a little too much. You need to remember that no matter at what stage of life we're at, work is part of being made in God's image. Okay? Then we go to the other side. And we say that it is good to rest. And it is not just good to rest as it comes. It is good to intentionally make the decision to rest. because rest has a purpose. It's not a byproduct of work. It is something that is supposed to be done in conjunction with work. And so when you rest, when you intentionally set aside time to rest, when you make a decision as a family or as an individual about how you're going to rest, remember all of the things that the Bible talks about, but even most of all, Genesis 2, when God looks back on his work and says, that is good. You should find satisfaction in your rest because you are working hard. And living in the middle, the final thing that we do is that we find, and I know this sounds kind of like a weird statement, but we find joy in our toil. We find joy in our work. Not the fact that our jobs are fantastic, which might not be the case, but the fact that we are working is something that aligns us and draws us deeper into our relationship with God. Because remember, going back to the beginning, God made man and woman in his image, and he gave them work to do in the garden before sin. And that was how they were supposed to spend their days. And so in that space, we desire to do the same. To spend our days being thankful for work, being thankful for rest, so that, as Solomon says, we might be occupied with the joy of our hearts. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come before you, before your throne, Lord, and we say thank you for work. Thank you for the opportunity to work. Thank you for the fulfillment that comes from producing and providing for ourselves, for our families, and for other people. Lord, our jobs are varied. There's many as the stars in the sky. There are a lot of things, Lord, that you have tasked us with, many things that are necessary for our world to continue clicking along. And God, whatever it is, we thank you for the opportunity to work. We thank you, Lord, for the ability to work as well, to carry out those jobs. And Lord, I especially pray for those who might be in a situation where acquiring work is difficult for them. Lord, not that they would cease seeking it, but God, that they might expand and see that work is something that is good, even if it's not a paycheck that we receive for it, that it can be done without a 9-to-5. God, I also pray for those of us who feel the burden of work upon our shoulders in a way that is unhealthy and unsustainable, and that we might remember that we are not stronger than Jesus, that we might look to him, the author and perfecter of our faith, and see that he rested. God, that it might be an intentional decision for us. And Lord, finally, as we come before you and work out all these things, Lord, finding joy in the pain of work is not easy. But we pray, Lord, because all things are possible by your Spirit, that for those of us who are working jobs that do not bring us joy in and of themselves, Lord, we might be able to see your purposes in working diligently for you and not for mankind. God, that we work because you created us to do it. Lord, we love you and we thank you. We thank you for the privilege of these things. In Jesus' name, amen.
All right. We're back in the studio. Connor is here.
Heyo.
And we are going to talk about work.
There we go. That's right.
Or
Get
maybe
down to
even not working.
We're working right now, right?
We're working. So
Men
we're
at
talk
work
about men
and women at work.
People at work, yes. Yeah. So tell us more.
I had one thing I wanted to sort of reemphasize that I think maybe didn't get enough attention, which was that I do think that there, in sort of the discussion about working and working with little rest, I don't think I spoke enough about the fact that there are definitely seasons of our life where you might have to go prolonged periods of time without rest. It could be, maybe you're a single parent, and you're having to work multiple jobs, or you could maybe you're short-staffed at work, or you have your own business and it's struggling right then, or there could be other things around it.
Children's pastors during the summer. That circles back to our pre-sermon talk.
That's right. There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. That's actually, yeah. I know I wasn't here for that, but I think that's a great example. Like, there are just seasons where you just have to press into it, and there's not as much of an expectation of rest. And I don't think that that's wrong. certainly when it becomes a necessity for the provision of your family. So the thing I want to reemphasize is the difference between seasons and schedule. And so seasons being periods of time where this is a necessity, and schedule being it's the like voluntary choice that we are operating without rest in an unhealthy way.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a significant difference. And so if there was anybody listening who, fell into that category of like, man, I'm sort of like nose to the grindstone right now. It is hard out there, and I'm doing it because of, I'm a college student and I need to save up money for the next school year or whatever it is, that kind of thing. That I think has its place. What doesn't has its place is just willfully disregarding God's command to rest.
Yeah.
So
I find it, for me, it's hard though if you go through a season that is really busy or there's limited rest. My personality a lot of times will make that a habit.
Yeah.
And then it's hard to get out. For me, it's hard to not find other things to do. And
Yeah.
So that's what I find.
Well, and once you go off of that pressing schedule and then you're back into more normative, it can make you feel, even knowing it, it makes you feel like you're almost being lazy just because you are taking
or your
Right.
adrenaline's
rest.
worn off. You're not going from one
Yeah.
thing to the next thing.
And
Yeah.
really you're just finding a healthy rhythm. So there's that whole message. And I think this whole guardrail series, each one really depends where you're at when you come to it. I think there are some people who need to work harder and there are some people who need to take it easy. And there's probably a message in there, hopefully for everyone. But Jason, you had said there was somebody had asked a question.
Yeah, actually, so my dad and I were talking because we were on vacation, and after he listened to the sermon, he said, "I hope they talk about retirement," and that's just what he said. There was really no question attached to it.
Yeah,
but what is your take on retirement? Should we be planning for retirement, quote unquote? Should we, what are some pointers there?
Yeah. Should we be planning for retirement? I'm not a certified financial planner.
Financially, or should
right.
we be
I don't mean
how
be saving money for a time when you may be working
yeah.
less or whatever, but should you be planning for a time that's okay, I'm going to work really, really hard until I'm 62 and then, nothing but beaches and that kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. And I probably should have mentioned that considering we have quite a few people at TBC who are retired. So here's my thought is I think that work as the Bible defines it is not something that is dedicated specifically to a paycheck. And so somebody who is dedicated to volunteering, working diligently in their garden, they are taking care of their grandkids, whatever it is. I think a lot of those things, we have to be careful, that it's not becoming just an excuse to call it work. But there are a lot of those things that I think are productive and provide and should be counted as work, even if you're not being paid for it. I think that there are many activities that, in that season of life that you have the ability, financial and time, to enjoy that you weren't able to enjoy before. And I think people should see that as a blessed rest, especially if they're able to do it. That almost goes back to that Ecclesiastes verse, right? Like if you have the wealth that you were able to accumulate from working diligently, and not to, your dad worked really hard.
Yeah, he did.
And still works.
Yeah.
But your dad worked especially hard when he was in his photography business. And so I think the ability to enjoy those things is a blessing from God. There are some, though, that I think, so the comment that I made in the message, and I think it's in the one that's in the podcast, but I said, you might need to watch a little bit less Gunsmoke and a little bit less classic movies.
Which that latter part I
there's somebody specifically in my
chord.
Life who that's them, and that's how they spend their entire day. And
can't do that.
And that, to me, that's not work, and if I could say one last thing, right, like that's not true rest either.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Rest is found, God-given rest is found when it is met with work. And so unless work is being done, the true God-given honoring rest is not really happening. It's just sort of slothfulness or laziness.
Right.
So I don't know that, going to on a vacation to Fiji counts as work and this expansive definition, but finding productive things to do where we are creating provision, being creative, putting forth hard work, as long as that is an element of retirement, I think that is a good thing.
I think it would be hard, just for me thinking from not being retired, obviously. I think it would be hard to replace that schedule.
Yeah.
You have a schedule that's
Yeah.
you have to be at work. Most people need to be at work or should be at work at a certain time, done at a certain time. And then when retirement, I think all those parameters are kind of thrown off. It's like, when is my work time? When is my recreation time kind of thing?
I think it's also easy to look at retirement from the macro level. Some people are like, I've worked for, however long, right? From 15 to 65 or whatever it is. I've worked 50 years, and now that was sort of my 6 days, and now retirement is my 7th day, and this is the time to rest. And I think the better way to look at it is each, sort of the rhythms that God has established on a micro level, that years and years and years of excessive not working, being lazy or things like that isn't really healthy for anybody.
Right.
And so I don't think we're supposed to just kind of ride off into the sunset, use our 401k and never, do anything to give back to our community or just do things that have value. So
I don't want to be the kind of person who, I have some family members, my parents were both state employees, and with the kinds of things that they were doing and just their personalities, they had that countdown timer going.
Right.
Like years out. Like, this is how many years, months, weeks, days I have until retirement. And I just, I want to just see it as a transition into a new season where I'm doing something different.
Yeah.
But still, hopefully engaging with people and sharing the love of Jesus with them. And yeah.
So I brought up a topic in the sermon that I think raised a few eyebrows, which is that when I was defining rest, I wasn't using the word Sabbath to do it. And I said that I would talk more about the Sabbath in the podcast. So I'm going to talk more about the Sabbath.
Yes.
And I'll be honest.
Jason and I love it when you mention that you're going to talk about that. I was like, podcast.
There we are. Nope, Dad, we're not talking about retirement. He just said we're talking about the Sabbath.
So I try and limit my podcast plugs, even though I love what we do here. It's a lot of fun. But so here's the thing is rest, the Sabbath has kind of become this term sort of used, I think the word would be colloquially, but used sort of in exchange for the word rest in Christian circles occasionally. People who will just talk about resting and they will say they're going to take a Sabbath, or they are needing to invite like Sabbath rest time in. So I just wanted to talk about that because and I'm going to kind of present an argument here. I don't think that Christians are required to keep the Sabbath, and I'm going to explain what that means and why it is not as crazy of a statement as it sounds right there.
Colloquially, some might call that a hot take.
There we go. So, okay, let's start at the beginning, right? So Genesis 2 is, which we went over in the sermon. Genesis 2 establishes the rhythm that God presents of 6 days of working and 1 day of rest. Significantly, at that point in time, the mention of Sabbath is not something that is introduced, okay? And so this is already part of the argument for those who are saying Christians should be practicing the Sabbath today, is they'll say, well, God really was, already showing that he was Sabbath resting. And it's like, well, that term was not used yet. And it's kind of difficult because the term Shabbat in Hebrew is the word that is used for resting from work, and then that is later picked up with the nation of Israel as what is to define their day. But nevertheless, God's 6-in-1 sort of ratio is not yet defined as Sabbath. You have to go to the institution of the law with the nation of Israel before you get to the Sabbath, right? So the first place it's really mentioned is in the Ten Commandments, okay? Or most popularly, right? And so in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, that is where first Exodus 20 is where the Ten Commandments are first given. Deuteronomy is where they're repeated after. We'll be going through Deuteronomy in the spring of 24. Moses is on the edge of the promised land. He's not going to be able to go in with everybody who made it through the book of Numbers. And he is repeating. He's basically giving his
remember
statements. And so what's interesting is you see very, very similar commands. Some of them are verbatim. Some of them are changed a little bit. And so I want to show you the two commands where he's reiterating the 10 commandments, how he speaks about the Sabbath here, all right? So Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11, and there's a decent amount of scripture in this whole thing. So this remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You must not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female servant, your livestock, or the resident alien who is within your city gates. And then the justification. For the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and everything in them in 6 days. Then he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and declared it holy. And so here the justification for the Sabbath is presented as mimicking what was done in creation, right? And so that flows with what we've already talked about. God is saying that you're supposed to look back on this, but importantly, it is an act of remembrance, okay? So already at the introduction of the Sabbath, it is presented not as something that is specifically so that you can like take it easy, take a break, that you can be rejuvenated for the next week. But
Netflix series, here we come.
Right, exactly, binging your favorite show, but that you are using this restful day of ceasing from work as a remembrance of the Lord and what he did in his creative work, okay? Now, when we go to Deuteronomy, you're going to see a different sort of flavor presented here. Moses speaking again when he says, verse 15, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Okay, well, now that's changed a little bit because those who got the Exodus, 10 Commandments, they were slaves. In fact, they were the ones where that command would be most relevant because they were the ones who were actually slaves.
Right.
Now we're speaking to their kids, or sometimes their kids, and they are understanding as a remembrance of God as Redeemer, right? This is the command. The command of creation, and remembering creation is not mentioned in Deuteronomy. It is the command of redemption. So both of these things these elements of Sabbath, keeping the Sabbath, as well as the entire calendar of Israel, are all instituted so that the nation of Israel would remember their God, who he is, what he has done, and specifically his presence with them, right? Because God rests with his people. So this now brings up a really significant topic, which is what did it mean when God gave commands to the nation of Israel and how that relates to us today, okay? Because the command is not whether Israel should have obeyed the Sabbath. They did, and they should have, but whether Christians should obey the Sabbath. And we also see some more language about obeying the Sabbath. Before I answer that question more fully, when we talk about how Israel obeyed the Sabbath, the prophet Ezekiel speaks to them about how they failed to do it, the reason why they failed to keep the Sabbath. And again, you're going to see here, now that we're searching for information about the Sabbath, you're going to see more about what the purpose of the Sabbath is based upon what the prophet is saying to the nation as he is condemning them. Right? So the prophet Ezekiel says, God is speaking through him, so I brought them out of the land of Egypt and then led them into the wilderness. Then I gave them my statutes and explained my ordinances to them. The person who does them will live by them. I also gave them my Sabbaths to serve as a sign between me and them, right? Because it's not just one Sabbath, there were multiple periods of rest. My Sabbaths to serve as a sign between me and them, so that they would know that I am the Lord who consecrates them, who sanctifies them, who redeems them. I added in those synonyms at the end. Verse 13, but the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not follow my statutes, and they rejected my ordinances. The person who does them will live by them. They also completely profaned my Sabbaths, so I considered pouring out my wrath on them in the wilderness to put an end to them. Now, the part here, and then later Psalm 95 is going to bring this up too, about how the Lord says he won't let people enter into his Sabbath rest. All has to do with the story we just learned about in the book of Numbers. That story, which will become more clear as we continue on through the Old Testament books, their rejection of God and wandering in the promised land is going to become like a flashpoint that is referenced throughout the rest of the generations as a failure and sort of a breaking point that signified all of the pain that was going to come. And part of that had to do with their rejection of the Sabbath. As a reminder, what the Sabbath represents is not that somebody gets to hang out on a couch, but that it is a day of remembrance of the Lord, of his creative effort, of his redemption of his people. And by failing to follow God, which is the narrative basically of the nation of Israel, by failing to do that, their failure came not from specifically doing certain things on the day, which is later what the Pharisees develop, right? These very specific rules and how far you could walk and all of those things where they added these rules. Later on, we're going to see that wasn't why they failed. They failed it because they failed to remember the purpose of the Sabbath and what it was supposed to do. And this is layered all on top of this.
They went as far as healing. They were upset about healing on the Sabbath.
Right.
Goat. It was a goat or sheep in the pulling out of the. I'm trying to remember.
Yeah,
the
Jesus
story.
criticizes them. He said, "Would you not pull out a sheep?"
And then the disciples eating grain, right? Because they were hungry.
I'm going to make you so happy in a second.
Oh, good. Sorry.
No, you're fine, because we're going to go there. I mean, that's what we should be doing, right? Anytime we're talking about these things, we should be trying to connect these parts. And that's what's hard about the Sabbath is it's like from beginning to the end, it's this development. And we run into a frequent question, which is how are we supposed to live with the elements that were given to Israel? And the normal dividing point, though it is kind of a messy one, is the difference between the law versus morals and wisdom. Right. And so one of the reasons that people advocate for practicing the Sabbath still to this day is they go, well, we practice of the 10 Commandments 1 through 3 and 5 through 10, but not 4, which is the Sabbath command. Right. So you're saying we shouldn't practice that one? Well, the difference is that all of the other commands are related to morals and wisdom that fit with God's character. The Sabbath is the only one that is instituted for the purpose of remembering who God is and is specifically used in covenant language. And so we've looked at an analogous topic to this would be circumcision. Okay. I know that's kind of a weird thing to get into, but the Bible talks about it so much that it is a sign of their covenant loyalty with God. And it represented morals and ethics and things like that. It represented their faithfulness to him, but in and of itself, it was a specific time and command for a group of people. Yeah. Okay. So that's a rough overview of the Sabbath in the Old Testament. Let's talk about the New Testament, because this is where the rubber hits the road. So the greatest place to go is going to be how Jesus interacted with the Sabbath. Okay, and Jason, you brought up one of the great examples of Jesus interacting with the Sabbath. And what's funny is that it seems like Jesus enjoyed doing things on the Sabbath.
It seemed like it.
There are a number of stories that begin with, and on the Sabbath day, Jesus did this thing. Now, it is important to state that Jesus did not break any of the Sabbath laws that were biblically presented. He went against what the Pharisees said they should be doing, but that was over and above. That was, which is funny. You go, the law is deep and wide enough. And the Pharisees are like, you know what, this doesn't
layer
have.
on top of layer on top of layer.
We need
of it.
more rules, right? So Jesus broke their rules. Jesus didn't break the Lord's rules, right? So there's this situation in Matthew 12, verses 1 through 8. And I'm going to read this section, then we'll kind of break something out. So at that time, Jesus passed through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick and eat some heads of grain. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "See, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath," right? So even there, we've got this context, right, where they're focused more on the activity instead of the sort of intention.
Yeah.
And that's what Jesus is going to pick apart. He said to them, "Haven't you read what David did when he and those who were with him were hungry, how he entered the house of God and they ate the bread of the presence," which would have been in this holy area, which is not lawful for him or for those with him to eat, but only for the priests? And so it's a rhetorical question. They have read this account. They know this story.
If not, there's some other issues too.
Or haven't you read in the law that on Sabbath days the priests in the temple violate the Sabbath and are innocent? And that's even interesting too, because modern Christian people who say we shouldn't work on Sunday, and yet here we are,
right?
Working at the church, working on Sunday kind of things, which brings in its own wrinkle. And so he's like, priests are working on the Sabbath. He's like, it's not. Verse 6, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. Both of those examples, right? Priests and David with the bread revolved around the temple. If you had known what this means, quote, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, which is, he's quoting an Old Testament passage, you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And later on in Mark, Jesus, this exact same account is being retold, only apparently Jesus also said in Mark 2, verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Okay, so let's talk about now what we know. What we know is that there were examples that God was okay with in the Old Testament of people not following the Sabbath, but those who were faithful to his covenant. David, his covenant king, these priests, the Levites, his covenant people. Well, all of them are his covenant people, but they were his priestly people, right? They were not guilty of breaking the Sabbath, even though they had apparently gone against something that should have been done on the Sabbath. And the reason why it was okay was because they understood the intention behind the Sabbath and the purpose for it of recognizing not only God's holiness and his redemptive effort, but also his act as creator. And so what is also important to recognize, that story was in Matthew 12, is what came immediately before it. In Matthew 11 is where Jesus has his the very end of Matthew 11 is where Jesus has his famous statement, come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take up my yoke and learn from me, because I am lowly and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Boom, into chapter 12, and we get an instruction on the Sabbath, okay? And that's not the only one. You have the one about the grain, and then that I just read, right. And then immediately after that, you have the one where the man is being healed. And right. That's where Jesus gives the statement about, if a lamb fell in a ravine, would you not go pick it up on the Sabbath? Yeah. So it's Jesus saying, this people have placed these heavy burdens upon you, and he's speaking not only about the Pharisees, but about the law. He's like, this law has placed a heavy burden upon you. It reveals sin, but also is burdensome to you. And then also these, again, the ruling class now have placed an even greater burden. And then we get to the end of chapter 11, and he's saying, and my yoke is easy, my burden is light, come follow me. And then we get an instruction about the Sabbath where he reveals that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. And then in Mark, that man was not made for Sabbath. That Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And so what Jesus is saying there is, I'm trying to reiterate the same thing, but that the Sabbath was not given as this thing, right? So that the Sabbath was not this eternal decree that then man was created and had to follow through with. The Sabbath was something that God gave to his people for a specific purpose. And what Jesus is saying, he's the Lord of the Sabbath, is now that he is going to be fulfilling the purpose of the Sabbath. All right? And by doing so, what he means is this element of rest. And this is sort of the through line. A lot of these things, the big biblical theology elements where you're looking at stringing a whole argument together, is you're looking for this through line. And the through line with the Sabbath is what it means to rest in God, okay? At the very beginning, it meant to have peace with God. This is what Adam and Eve have in the Garden of Eden, right? They have rest with God. And then that rest is broken, and then God said he is going to rest with his people, and this is him in the tabernacle, right? And then later in the temple. But ultimately, it was supposed to be in the promised land. And then you have Psalm 95 from the events of the book of Numbers, where God says, I'm not going to let them enter my rest, right? And so then, again, this through line, this question is being asked as we walk through the Old Testament, who will enter, who will actually, like the prophet Ezekiel, right? You have profaned the Sabbaths. You are not resting with the Lord. Who will actually accomplish the purpose of the Sabbath, which is rest with God? And that is what Jesus does. He accomplishes the Sabbath rest. This is what the book of Hebrews picks up on in chapter 4. And Hebrews chapter 4 is a whole long thing, actually, about how the Sabbath relates to New Testament Christians that more of us should read, because this is where a lot of the meat comes from. But he says, for if Joshua, the writer of Hebrews says, for if Joshua had given them rest, right? Joshua is the one that brings them into the promised land. For if Joshua had been able to give them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. When what he means there is, why would God be speaking about a future day of rest if full rest could be achieved?
Right.
Therefore, a Sabbath rest remains for God's people. For the person who has entered his rest has rested from his own works, just as God did from his. Let us then make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will fall into the same pattern of disobedience. So this is kind of our smoking gun. So when we went through Leviticus and we look at the sacrifices, right? And we say, hey, these sacrifices, they represent what Jesus is going to do in the future. They not only share how God feels eternally about sin, that's the same thing that's being shown through the bulls and Jesus Christ, but there's a different context for how they're being done, and Jesus ultimately fulfills the Old Testament and shows a greater truth. That is what the Sabbath should be viewed in the same box as we view the Old Testament sacrifices, that it was a command given to the nation of Israel that was supposed to show them something, display a greater truth that was coming. And what Hebrews 4 here is saying that there is a Sabbath rest, an eternal Sabbath rest for those who trust in Jesus. He's talking about people who die and enter into a Sabbath rest. He's not saying like Christians still today
we can find that state of Sabbath,
like this Saturday or this Sunday you can find your Sabbath rest.
Right.
He's saying there's an eternal Sabbath rest, and that is what sort of the law was attempting to provide, was showing, was that except Israel did not follow it, right?
Right.
Therefore, the tragic continual story of Israel, Jesus comes along because they have failed to do this. So the Sabbath points to Jesus and fulfills the same mission that it did in the Old Testament. Jesus is the creator, Jesus is the redeemer, and Jesus is the savior. The same things that the Sabbath is supposed to remind Israel of. Remember back to Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. So now we come to the question that is almost answered, but not just yet, which is, should Christians practice the Sabbath? And there are two important parts to this. The first one is we can see, because the Bible shares it, what it was like for early Jewish Christians, right? Jesus is resurrected, they're in Jerusalem, and they're like, okay, we trust in Christ. We are Jewish by our culture and our heritage, Christians, because we've trusted in him as our Savior. And what are the elements of we would call it the Old Testament. What are the elements of our sort of scriptures that we are supposed to bring forth into this new faith, right? And this becomes a huge debate, the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. Now that the gospel is going out to the pagans, right? Now that it's going out to the Gentiles, what are the elements of Jewish culture and the law that are supposed to be continued on into these environments?
Like what is cultural and what is mandated.
Right.
Exactly. Yes. And so you see fights about it, like one of the arguments becomes over circumcision. Should Christians in Greece become circumcised, right? They end up saying, no, they don't need to be. Anyhow, in Acts 15, Peter speaks up and he says, therefore, in my judgment, we should not cause difficulties for those among the Gentiles who turn to God. But instead we should write to them, to abstain from things polluted, and this is the list he gives. These are the things that made it through. Abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from eating anything that has been strangled, and from blood. For since ancient times, Moses has had those who proclaim him in every city, and every Sabbath day he is read aloud in the synagogues. Let me tell you why that's interesting. It's not like he forgot about Sabbaths. He just listed on Sabbath days, we used to read the scriptures, read it in the synagogue. And he says, but the things that are to go forward, and really these things are more like so that we can interact with one another. If Gentile Christians are eating food that was strangled, it's going to be really hard for us as Jewish believers to have fellowship with them, right? So even these are just like quality of life things. It's not because they were a part of the law that must persist. And even at this sort of level of like, okay, what must be included so that we can engage in fellowship together? Practicing the Sabbath is not a part of it. Okay. The Sabbath points to Jesus, and Jesus points to this eternal rest. And as a part of that, and as a part of that eternal rest, we are, as Christians, supposed to celebrate the eternal rest that we have in Jesus, and we are not supposed to get bogged down in the legalese of the Old Testament. In Colossians 2, verses 16 through 17, I have this in one other verse for those playing along at home. This is what Paul says, "Therefore, don't let anyone judge you in regard to food and drink, or in the matter of a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of what was to come. The substance is Christ."
Wow, it's right there.
Right. And so, just what am I trying to say here?
Yeah.
You get it?
Yeah.
Like that these elements in the Old Testament are pointing towards Jesus.
Sure.
Jesus fulfills them. And the truth that was nestled in them back in the Old Testament is still the truth today. But the truth in the Old Testament was never that you were supposed to be on the couch and take it easy, which is so often kind of how we're viewing it. Christian Sabbatarians are just like, the Sabbath is when I don't work. And it's like, well, that's not the truth that's being presented in the Old Testament. The truth is Christ. The substance is found in Christ.
You mentioned the word Sabbatarians. Is that another one of those divisions? Like, is that really I need to Google it, but is that really
there's kind of a spectrum of those who, as Christians, believe that we should practice the Sabbath. Some people view it very literal, and that'd be like Sabbatarians. So like, now they aren't, they're not Christians, but like, I believe Seventh-day Adventists, right? So they're going to practice a literal Sabbath. But even within,
a literal Sabbath on a Saturday.
Yeah.
Yes.
So even genuine Christians, though, who are practicing a Sabbath, oftentimes it will, if it's not literal, it will at least be the concept. And so they'd say, I have Sunday off, or I have Saturday off, and that is going to be the day that I Sabbath. I have a good friend of mine who really values the command to Sabbath, and as he understands it. And for him and his wife, that means that they, like Friday evenings, they practice actually the like sundown math of the Sabbath. So it's like from sundown on Friday till sundown on Saturday.
Okay.
That they are going to do nothing, and they eat well and spend time with friends. And so, pin that. Let me get to that in just a moment. One last verse. And this is kind of where actually the teaching comes from. The application, moreover. Romans 14:5. One person judges one day to be more important than another day. Someone else judges every day to be the same. Let each one be fully convinced in his own mind. Whoever observes the day observes it for the honor of the Lord. So here's the thing. I didn't mention the Sabbath in the message because I don't think the command for rest, as we're talking about it from work, is the Sabbath command per se. I think that the Sabbath command, as I've explained, relates much more to Christ and pointing to him and a number of other things. And I think that it is misleading to use the word Sabbath to talk about a day of rest in my context. There are plenty of people who are still going to prefer to use that term to talk about their day of rest. And this is where Romans comes in, because no matter what I've said, there are still some people, if they're still listening, who believe that they should have a Sabbath day of rest. As Christians, as people who have trusted in Christ, if they believe that, they should still do that. Right? If they believe that, they should still do that. Because the command to not Sabbath is not present in Scripture.
Right.
Jesus just comes to fulfill the command, right? And so if somebody would wish to do that, I still think that they can. And that's the context that Paul's speaking to. He's like, if somebody says they still want to practice, if they're a Jewish Christian in particular, and they still want to practice the Sabbath, he's like, let them do it.
Yeah, he says no judgment on festivals, new moon, or Sabbath, one way or the other.
Yeah, that's the Colossian one.
Right.
But here's the flip side to that, though, is you can't hold that standard to other people.
Yes,
right?
You can't weaponize it to.
Yeah, because it's not. It's also, though it's not precluded from sort of Christian obedience, it is also not included in Christian obedience. And so this concept of practicing the Sabbath, I think, is one, if we are going to take this measure of rest forward, here's how I think we should do it. In the first hand, you're supposed to remember that the way that we define the Sabbath today, many Christians, the way that they use the word Sabbath, is not a biblical definition of Sabbath. Mm-hmm. And I don't even mean like all the things I just talked about. I just mean to an Old Testament version. It's like the same way that we use the word tithing today.
Yes, it's not.
Tithing does not mean today. Tithing in the Old Testament was not just giving 10% of your income, right? And so we have to be careful even using the word Sabbath because it means something very specific. Mm-hmm. Second, you need to recognize that Jesus is the ultimate Sabbath rest and the source of that rest, and the Sabbath was pointing to him whether or not you choose to practice the Sabbath today as a Christian. Jesus is the fulfillment of those things, and finding a day where you don't work might remind you, and you might choose to have that be a way that you construct your family schedule around reminding you and being worshipful of Christ. Mm-hmm. But third, that it is not a commandment in the New Testament for Christians, right? That it is something, because Jesus fulfilled it, we place it back with the other Old Testament laws. And even though it is one of the 10 Commandments, the 10 Commandments are still included as a part of the law, right? The 10 Commandments are, yes, very important. And we do practice 9 out of the 10 of them. But the fourth one is one that had specific meaning for a specific group of people and during a specific time. So if you are still seeking to find rest in those things, I think it is good to rest. I think it's good to be intentional about rest. I think when you rest, you should be worshiping Jesus and being thankful and counting your blessings, like I think the Ecclesiastes passage mentioned. But I'm not going to call it a Sabbath. And furthermore, so like for my schedule, and actually Jason and I operate on the same schedule. We work Tuesday through Friday and Sunday, and we have Saturday and Monday off, right? Yep. And so on Monday is normally my most relaxed, chill day that I have in my schedule. I don't know about you. I know you have kids doing homeschool stuff and different things like that.
I would say that Saturday is more of our, even though sometimes it's not a super chill day with everything going on, but Monday is typically our kids get back to school. Especially a school year, we get things done, that kind of thing.
But I think that's also what I would lean into is that, based upon the definition that I made, that I think the Bible supports, even though you are working on those days, I don't think that you are somehow like sinning against the Holy Lord because there is work included in all of those elements of your days, right? Because you are not held to follow a 24-hour Sabbath like the Israelites
counting
were.
Steps, that type of thing.
Even beyond all that.
And I will even say the definition of the idea behind the Sabbath that we're talking about, I mean, I think it's very important as much as you can every day to find your rest in Christ, find your your day found in Christ there. So I don't even think... I think seeing it as a day that I have to do it all in one day is kind of setting you up to fail as well.
Yeah. And this is where Christian freedom comes in. Like if people choose to do that, that's fine. But if you were literally going to practice the Sabbath, it would have to be on Saturday because that's the biblical definition of Sabbath. And it would include a lot of things that came into the Old Testament. The Sabbath is not Sunday. The Sabbath is not Saturday, right? The Sabbath is the Sabbath is not Friday, excuse me. It is something very specific. And so if you choose to do that, that's on you. But if you choose not to, you're not guilty. And moreover, it is important, like Jason just said, that we practice Sabbath, the element of Sabbath, rest eternally as we reflect on our faith in Jesus Christ and intentionally find physical rest other places for the reasons that we've already stated. So that was my thing. I needed to get off my chest.
Thank you. And you stopped short of saying we should be able to have our Chick-fil-A nuggets on Sunday. You stopped right short of that. So
there you go.
We're good. All right. Well, guys, thank you. As always, we've got another Guardrails message this Sunday.
Yep.
Is this one?
This one's on Friends.
Friends. Okay.
Yep.
Oh, good.
Yep.
Look forward to that. We hope you have a wonderful week. Talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to the TBC Extra Podcast. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.
We drop an episode every Wednesday, and on the first Friday of each month, we have an extra episode. Extra! With stories, pastoral teaching, interviews, and more.
See you next time, and have a great rest of your week.